We're here for our panel discussion on Indian slavery and unspoken history, and I'm really excited about this. As I started to learn more about my own history, one of the most exciting and also daunting and saddening things was to learn that a large amount of the slaves that were enslaved were actually darker-skinned Indians, and it's not talked about as much as it is the experiences of our African brothers and sisters. So we want to add that element to the discussion as well, to understand that this thing called slavery, it's not just for one group of people. It's not just the Africans who were enslaved. A lot of our Irish brothers and sisters made their way here through quote unquote indenture, which is slavery by another name. So this is an issue that affects everyone from a cultural perspective, and we really wanted to highlight an aspect of it that's seldom talked about.
We're talking about something that's very, very important. And this particular geographic location played a pretty large role in this enslavement of Indians. I said enslavement because they're not slaves, but folks were enslaved.
Cacican of the Baramaya Guanilla clan in the Guanilla region of Borinquen, which is known to many today as Ponce, Puerto Rico. And what I wanted to run through today was a very, the Taïnos as a population exist in very few artifacts and mostly through oral history. We hosted a Indigenous Peoples Conference last year and had Cacique Guanaqueyu, who is one of the last few predominantly full-blooded Taïnos living today. Is over 60% Taïno blood, indigenous blood to North America. And so he's one of, there's less than 5. And so he's one of the last living ones. So it's an honor to continue to be able to speak on the plight of the Taïno people who have been transformed into what we know today as Puerto Ricans. And so if you are Puerto Rican or know Puerto Ricans, they come in all shades and colors. And that's because as their indigenous roots go, as Taínos, they were mixed with the Spanish conquistadors and African slaves. So I'm just going to run through a timeline for you, which is documented, which is a cross of a mixture of oral history and documented Spanish history, which will end with an image of a little piece of documented U.S. history. So as we know, when we learned in elementary school in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he hit the Caribbean first as what they called the West Indies, and saw indigenous people, which gave them the name Indians. He hit Hispaniola in that region, which is modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, and circled through modern-day Puerto Rico, Cuba, and southern Florida, all of which is what the Taínos inhabited. So they inhabited the Caribbean region as well as southern Florida. So in 1493 was his second voyage to the New World, where he actually landed in Borinquen and documented as many as 50,000 Taínos across Borinquen and Hispaniola, as they called it, which was Dominican Republic and Spain. So in so what happened was he comes back, shares all of this, and it catches the attention of the Spanish crown, who then commissioned Ponce de León to head back out there. He does and meets Cacique of Caciques, Agüevano. And Agüevana is the Cacique of Caciques, a chief of chiefs. And as the story goes, he shows them the entire wealth that they have. They don't know it's wealth. They think it's offerings for their gods. And so this is gold. Taïno stands for the good people. They're not what you would hear of like Aztecs or Mayans with temples and sacrifice killings and things like that. They're not even a warrior race to that extent. So Aguevana goes back to Spain with Ponce de Leon, and Ponce de Leon comes back with an armada and begins the wiping out of the Taìno Indians. So in 1501, the Spanish crown then approves the export of slaves from Spain to the Americas, to all of their colonies in that area. And by 1508, 1510 is when colonization takes full flight. And so by 1509 is when they establish repartimientos. And essentially what that is indentured servitude. And it consisted of distributing among officials and colonists fixed numbers of Indians for wage-free and forced labor. And so the crown then instituted something called encomienda, which is supposed to replace repartimientos after priests were in an uproar about the treatment of these indigenous people. So Spain, being the colonizer, just rebranded slavery. And then by as the Taínos saw Spaniards coming with their ships and weapons and things that they had never seen before, they thought they were immortals. And so Cacique Yuaran and his warriors, as the story goes, drowned San Diego, which was a conquistador who was notorious for beating, killing, and raping Taínos. They drown San Diego and watch him for 7 days to make sure that he doesn't rise. And when he doesn't, word spreads across all of the islands that the Spaniards are not immortal. And an uproar begins, and Spain then begins a war against Taínos. And what was once kind of like a soft enslavement became an all-out slaughter and full enslavement, to which many Taínos fled to the mountains or off the islands. And many died along the way, but they also dispersed to parts of South America and the Gulf Coast. And so by 1513, African slaves are introduced into the islands. And by 1517, King Carlos V authorized the importation of 4,000 slaves to the Caribbean. So from 1520 to the 1800s, there was an ongoing slave trade that passed through the Caribbean. And as you could imagine, by this time, as they're colonizing the United States, it's continuing on through the Caribbean. If anyone saw the movie Amistad and the fort in San Juan, it was a major port for the slave trade. And so by 1803, all the major global powers were starting to abolish slavery among their colonies: the British, the Dutch, the French. Spain, on paper, abolishes slavery in Puerto Rico in 1873. However, I have an image there. During the Spanish-American War and the signing of the Paris Treaty, the United States creates, they develop a baseline census, 1899. You can actually go to census.gov and find the census. It's the baseline census for, for Puerto Rico by the U.S., taken in 1899, that enumerates coloreds, free and enslaved, men and women. And so at some point in time, there was an agreement to adhere to the abolishment of slavery, but obviously there wasn't. If the U.S. as they start enumerating individuals in Puerto Rico, are now they're documenting slaves there, and colored slaves. So what's also interesting about the 1899 census of Puerto Rico is that they also validate the existence of Aborigines. So they mention in this census that Spain, for a long time, was boasting about the genocide and the wiping out of the Taínos. Yet, what the census says is that there are captains who are scouring the land as they start colonizing and taking over, and finding Aborigine, this is a quote, Aborigine-looking people with wide noses, flat in the front and back, who are who must be Aborigines, and disproving the claim of Spanish census, because Spain kept census as well. So that was Spain tried to establish the paper genocide of Aborigines by just calling them dark slaves, and the U.S. creating a baseline census references Aborigines as people in the mountains in 700 or 800 numbers, but anyone who was of a darker complexion was either white or colored. There was no acknowledgement of Aborigines or Indians, Taínos in particular, after that census. They then become Puerto Ricans. And so the classification begins that way and continues to today. So that is what we know through documentation and oral history of the enslavement of the Taínos, who have become modern-day Puerto Ricans today.